I just want to say I've known Narasimha now for 5 years, and it's been a real pleasure working with him. In part because our interests overlap so much, but also in part because he's such a gentleman and a serious scholar. It's great to see someone do work that deals with important economic issues and that looks closely at the underlying energy technology issues, but also has attention to the underlying ethical issues. And as you will see today, and probably already know, his thesis really embraces all of that. There's been a lot of work to try to figure out international climate policies and how to distribute burdens across countries, how much to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But what Narasimha does in his thesis goes beyond that, and he says, how can you introduce an international effort, but at the same time make sure that subnationally, that is within countries, there's equitable distribution of the burden. And it raises some really difficult issues, because on the one hand, you want to make sure in an international agreement that what happens within countries is fair and effective. It doesn't hurt the lowest income or the least advantaged individuals in that country. At the same time, you don't want this to be a case where sovereignty is being lost, and that there's too much control from the outside on the inner workings of a country. Narasimha's work really deals very, very nicely with these issues. As Narasimha will indicate, he starts off with some broad philosophical questions. What should be the objectives here? What are the components of equitable climate policy? He then talks about an important issue for distribution, namely kerosene subsidies in a portion of India. He goes on then in another chapter to look at the impacts of alternative electricity pricing in India with attention to the distributional impacts, and then concludes with a lot of close attention to some serious issues of implementation. So it's a thesis that's very broad, that attacks really important, fundamental issues, and that goes a long way to advancing our knowledge in these areas. So it's been a pleasure. Nice to be able to introduce you.
Thank you, Larry, for the introduction. I wish I noted that down. You summarized my research so well. It would be useful. It is being noted down.
So that's what I'm doing.
Well, thank you all for being here. The Copenhagen Accord marked an important milestone in climate negotiations. It marked an important milestone in climate negotiations because it was the first time that heads of state agreed to a specific target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And although this is not a legally binding agreement, it acknowledges our collective responsibility for protecting future generations from the harms of climate change. But it also commits us to significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and to cap our future emissions. But we are a long way to go in reaching that target. So if we look at all the pledges that have been made by countries since Copenhagen to reduce emissions, they add up to only 60% of the required emissions reductions. In fact, we are most certainly likely to exceed 3 degrees centigrade, as opposed to the target of 2 degrees centigrade. So how do we get from here further down to 2 degrees centigrade? One of the biggest obstacles has been, and will likely continue to be, the difficulty in getting agreement between developed and developing countries on how to share mitigation responsibility. Now, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has embodied in it this principle, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which essentially intends to differentiate nations' responsibilities on the basis of their stages of development. And most major economies have ratified this agreement, and therefore it's incumbent upon us to implement this principle. However, despite numerous interpretations of this principle in literature, it has not made serious inroads into international negotiations. Now, perhaps one way to appreciate the moral dilemma is to look at the aggregate contribution of greenhouse gas emissions by large developing economies and compare that to their per capita emissions levels. And barring China, of course, which blurs the lines, large developing economies contribute a significant amount in aggregate emissions, but have very low per capita emissions, which is to say that they contribute a lot of emissions from a lot of poor people. So it seems morally compelling that there's a need for emissions to grow unencumbered from mitigation costs. However, on the other hand, if one looks at the growth of emissions, the share of developing countries' emissions are actually growing. In fact, it is expected that by 2030, half of future emissions will come from large developing economies, including China and India. And to the extent, since we have a cap, or since we would like to have a cap on emissions, to the extent that developing countries' emissions grow, the burden on developed nations to reduce their emissions would increase. So it also seems compelling that to the extent developing countries can reduce their emissions affordably, that they should be compelled to do so. Now, it is true that the political interests of countries align with different views of fairness. But it is also the case that the formulations of equity by developing nations on moral grounds have also had shortcomings. One of the views that has been most popular has been that of resource rights for states. That is, every individual ought to have an equal right to emissions. But this right is granted to states on the basis of population. So if one crudely imagines states collapsed into just their average per capita emissions, and based on a threshold that is determined most likely by science, countries with per capita average emissions that lie below the threshold would be exempt from mitigation, while countries above the threshold would be subject to mitigation till they get down to the threshold. Now, while there are several concerns with this view, the concern that I'm interested in is that countries are not homogeneous. And in fact, they have heterogeneous populations with higher income inequality, which reflect very different emission levels within the countries. So take, for instance, if we implemented this rule on the basis of average emissions, using the world average as a threshold, just as an example, India and Brazil would be exempt from any form of mitigation, even though 35 million Indians emit above the world average. And conversely, China would not be exempt, but there are over 800 million people who would be exposed to the potential mitigation burdens from such a regime. Furthermore, per capita emissions or rights to emit are not necessarily a very morally compelling measure of human development because they're a means to an end. And it would make more moral sense to define a threshold on the basis of income or some other human development index. And so that's the starting point that I take in my work, which is that individuals rather than states ought to be exempt from mitigation burdens as opposed to having a right to pollute, and that threshold should be defined on the basis of income. But my interest in my dissertation is to go beyond and think about what are the implications of implementing this principle in sovereign states, keeping in mind that the interest of this principle is to preserve individual development needs, but agreements will most likely be implemented by states. And so I'm interested in the implications of that disconnect. I was trying to think of a metaphor to represent sort of my interest in the interdisciplinariness of bridging gaps in the literature. And I thought of, imagine that the game of achieving the target of 2 degrees C is a goal to be achieved by countries playing a game of soccer. Then I think of the justice literature as I'm reminded of the Monty Python skit. I don't know if I'm dated in this example, as philosophers who square off in a soccer game, and when the whistle is blown, instead of kicking the ball, they start to ponder how they're going to achieve the goal. And that, in some sense, reflects the literature, which is not necessarily thinking of policy implications. But on the other hand, you have a large literature by realists and policymakers who are thinking about what works and not necessarily considering the justice implications. And so in some sense, I'm trying to make small attempts to bridging this gap. And on the one hand, implementing justice principles in sovereign nations is my interest. So how do sovereign policies that influence the implementation of an exemption for the poor within states, influence the implementation of an exemption for the poor within states? And on the other hand, I'm interested in examining what the distributional impacts of climate mitigation and energy policies are in India. I'm going to start with the justice question. There have been several proposals that have tried to quantify and implement this particular principle, and I'll use the greenhouse developments right proposal as an example and as a basis for illustrating the issues that I'm concerned with. So imagine India's income distribution, and imagine that under when there's no exemption and they're under a cap, that all countries proportionately have to reduce their emissions based on some measure of some indicator such as their income. With the introduction of an exemption for a certain population below a threshold, because we have a cap, all other parties, the non-poor, would have to increase their contributions to mitigation. And it is assumed in literature in most of these proposals that this would be shared proportionately by the affluent or the non-poor. And so I'm interested in this, let's call that incremental cost the exemption burden. And I'm interested in the exemption burden borne by other parties to an agreement, which is due to the exemption of the poor in India. And I'm interested in the factors that influence the size of this burden. Now, of course, the exemption threshold is the primary factor that would influence it, but I'm not concerned with that particular issue as to where one ought to define a basic threshold. What I'm more interested in is sovereign policies influence other parties' exemption burden. And that can happen in one of two ways. They can influence the number of poor and their emissions, which would then increase the size of the total emission burden, or sovereign policies can influence the extent to which growth occurs in the country and the extent to which that the affluent in India bear the share of that exemption burden. And both would serve to influence what other people bear of the exemption of the poor. So for example, consider population growth policies through female education or better fuel choices for households that reduce carbon intensity would reduce the poor's emissions and therefore reduce the exemption burden borne by other parties. But faster growth on the part of India and a distribution of growth that is distributed above the threshold would increase the share borne by people in India, and that would also reduce the exemption burden borne by other parties. So this is a principle of what is an appropriate baseline to define for defining an exemption burden. And to the extent that sovereign policies are influencing what other people have to bear for the mitigation burden raises a couple of issues. And in order to understand how important this is of an issue this is, I was thinking of quantifying the extent to which alternate growth paths within India would change this exemption burden. So I developed a simulation model of alternative growth paths in India in order to understand how variations in these basic parameters that influence a growth path would influence what other countries have to bear for the exemption of the poor. So taking a baseline based on a set of indicators that are representative of the last decadal trends in India, I consider variation in these parameters. A change in carbon intensity. India has pledged to reduce its carbon intensity by 20% below 2005 levels in the next decade. If it doesn't implement that, that would have an effect on the poor's emissions. And if there's variations in these three indicators which influence the total distribution of future growth around a threshold, it would also alter the exemption burden. I use a log normal model of income distribution because this is the best mathematical representation that actually is close to representing empirical data in developing countries. And I find that using a sort of plausible range of variation in these indicators, that the sensitivity is in the order of $1 to $3 billion a year. That is, if India did not honor its carbon intensity pledge of reduction, that would increase the exemption burden by a range of 40%. And if the combination of these variables were varied, there would be a 10% change in the exemption burden as well. Now, this, of course, depends on the baseline exemption burden and the mitigation costs that I've assumed. But I found that for any kind of baseline based on different levels of mitigation or exemption costs, that these percentages are fairly robust in the sensitivity. So the question is this a large enough number to be concerned about? Now, in my dissertation, I don't actually examine whether countries will have an incentive to influence sovereign policies on the basis of this. But it raises an issue. This is a non-trivial cost and presents a couple of issues. Firstly, the ethical concern is, should benefiting states, as in states that benefit from an exemption, be held to a standard of future growth and emissions? Because their sovereign policies are influencing the extent of the poor's emissions, which in turn is affecting the exemption burden borne by other countries. And the other issue that arises is that parties to an agreement may have a financial incentive to base their participation on aggressive reduction in the poor's emissions. So from an ethical standpoint, one would question that perhaps there would be policies that reflect negligence on the part of countries in terms of poverty alleviation that may justify holding them to a certain standard. But for a country as a whole, it would be extremely difficult to justify an objective standard to hold countries to that would define what sovereign policies ought to be followed in order to minimize the extent of the poor emissions. But regardless of what's right and wrong, it may still be that parties wouldn't be willing to participate in an agreement unless they had some sort of assurance or some reciprocal measures on the part of benefiting states to minimize the cost of that exemption. This analysis in the study is that developing countries have weak mechanisms of redistribution. So for example, India has no broad-based income tax system and only 2 to 3% of the population pay income taxes. And this is common in a lot of developing countries, as a result of which governments rely on second-best mechanisms of redistribution, such as consumption subsidies for food and energy. And that's why, given that in India you also have very poor record of targeting subsidies, that it's an additional concern of imposing mitigation policies in a society where there could be adverse distributional impacts. And so I want to take on two studies. One of them is mitigation in the electricity sector, and the other is the removal of the kerosene subsidies. In both cases, the focus of my analysis is India, and one state in India, Maharashtra. And the reason I picked the state is because it represents a fairly good microcosm of the economic conditions that I'm interested in, as well as income inequality distribution. It also is a state with very well-functioning institutions. So to the extent that I identify institutional limitations in influencing the distribution of costs, this presents a conservative view. Since I'm interested in the individual impacts of policies, the unit of my analysis is households, and I rely on a fairly well-established national data set on household consumption expenditure for my analysis. However, this data set doesn't have a very good representation of energy, and so I actually conducted my own fieldwork of 450 households to understand the conditions under which households consume energy. And again, the motivation for doing this study and the gaps in literature is that most analyses of mitigation policy impacts in India focus on aggregate growth impacts and don't look at distributional impacts. Furthermore, the concern is to examine how mitigation costs would increase the cost of expanding access, and there's less of an emphasis on the cost to those who have electricity access. So for example, those who consume energy with market prices but are at the margins of poverty and could potentially be pushed into poverty from increases in energy prices due to mitigation. And so the focus of my thesis in this part of the analysis is mostly on the short-term consumption shocks from increased energy prices. In the case of the electricity analysis, I take as my policy scenario that India implements its pledge in Cancun to reduce its carbon intensity by 20% below 2005 levels in 2020. And I represent this as an increase in low carbon electric supply, essentially moving from coal to a composition of low carbon sources driven primarily by gas. Now, of course, one can imagine that policymakers didn't put a lot of thought into that number, and it really was intended to try and capture historical trends in the reductions in carbon intensity. But there have been concerns that there has been an upturn in carbon intensity due to an increase in the share of manufacturing in the economy, which has very high energy intensity. And there also has been, in the last decade, a significant investment in low carbon resources, as in non-coal resources, not because of climate change considerations, but really energy security considerations. So it's a fairly plausible assumption that, or plausible scenario, that energy intensity may in fact increase. And so therefore, to achieve this target only by reducing carbon intensity, keeping energy intensity constant, is fairly reasonable. And the question I want to ask in this analysis is, what leverage do policymakers have to influence the distribution of these costs to households? The key challenges that I faced in this analysis is, first of all, to represent the indirect impacts of energy price increases that result from economy-wide increases in the cost of goods and services. Because the targeting mechanisms for shielding low-income groups from income shocks is largely in residential prices, but does not cover the bulk of household consumption or household expenditure. Secondly, markets don't determine prices in the Indian context, but regulatory agencies determine prices. And so I was interested in understanding how to represent regulatory decision making, which is of course driven by several factors, including political pressures, cost considerations, as well as a regulatory mandate. So my approach was to calibrate and understand the baseline conditions in which households consume energy. And the idea here is to represent as much as possible the factors that would influence how mitigation costs would be distributed, simulate the decision-making process by the regulator in terms of how to set prices given the cost shock, and simulate households' decisions in response to those price increases. And then evaluate the welfare impacts for households against the baseline conditions, but noting that in the Indian context, regulators don't really have a firm decision-making criteria. They make decisions on an ad hoc basis. And so I impute certain social welfare objectives to regulators' decision-making in order to understand if they did care about equity, how would they price electricity? If they cared about economic efficiency, how would they distribute costs? And so with these objectives, let me first describe the baseline conditions with an intent to understand what the differences are across the income groups. So over 60% of the population earns below $2 a day, and the top 2% of the population represent the affluent who have life standards of living like you and me. But of course, there's a disproportionate per capita usage across these income groups, so that the share of consumption is much higher for higher income groups. But nevertheless, the total consumption is still dominated by low income groups. And what this means is that there would be limited capacity for cross-subsidization from higher income groups. Secondly, from my fieldwork, I found out that households pay an inordinately high amount of their budget on electricity. Low-income households pay 9 to 10% of their budgets on electricity, and this is above fairly high compared to international standards. And the concern, of course, is that this is at the baseline, not considering mitigation costs being imposed on top of this. And thirdly, the indirect costs that households would face from indirect price increases depend upon what they consume in the household, in their consumption expenditure. The lowest income households spend 60% of their budget on food, whereas higher income households have a much more balanced portfolio. And depending upon the electricity intensity of these industries that go into manufacturing these goods, households would face different indirect price increases. And that is one of the data points that would influence the extent to which regulators are able to shield households from the price shocks of mitigation. The final peculiarity I want to discuss regarding households is there's chronic scarcity of supply in India. And as a result of that, regulators or utilities, but approved by regulators, ration load across households, across regions, based on their revenue recovery potential. And the principle is, if we got to cut load somewhere, let's cut it where we recover the least amount of revenues. And households' outages are in fixed proportion, depending upon what region they're located in. Based on my fieldwork, I verified that this is in fact the case. And I also found out that certain types of households have ways to insulate themselves from outages, such as by investing in backup supply and equipment. But that's only higher income households who experience outages for a few hours. I represent this as a reduction in the electricity consumption from what households would intend to consume. And I apply the same ratio as the distribution of outages to the reduction in electricity consumption by households. And why is this important in a mitigation impact study? Well, to the extent households are not actually receiving electricity, they have lower electricity budgets, and they are less vulnerable to price increases. They may suffer welfare losses from not having electricity, such as quality of life issues or livelihood issues, but they're less vulnerable to price increases. So it's important just to capture the actual extent to which households are consuming energy. Secondly, to the extent that supply interruptions can be reduced because demand contracts when energy prices increase from following mitigation, that could be a potential co-benefit of pursuing mitigation policies. There's a current trend in pricing that is also peculiar to the Indian context. The red bar shows the average cost, whereas the blue bar shows the actual rates currently. And the industrial rates in India, unlike in most countries, are higher than residential rates. But there's been pressure to decrease them and to increase residential rates towards average cost because industry have been migrating off of the grid in the face of higher prices. And so this is another factor that implies regulators may want, due to political pressures, to increase costs, to increase rates towards average cost if average costs increase due to mitigation policies. So just to summarize, you have low-income households who have high electricity budgets, who have potentially have outages, and have potentially facing rates that would be increasing due to mitigation being followed. And the question is, to what extent can regulators leverage the limited policy levers they have to allocate distribution costs in a manner that does not cause them high welfare losses. So I want to describe the simulation model. I have the regulator decision problem, which is to set prices to recover a supply cost increase. And their main policy levers are residential rates and industrial rates. The residential rates allow them some limited means of income-based discrimination. This is the block tier tariff structure, where households pay a weighted average of the blocks in which they consume. And it is a fairly good basis for income-based price discrimination because households consume in proportion to their income. So the highest income households are the only households that consume on the upper block. So regulators can isolate price changes to the highest income block through this tier. On the other hand, the lowest income groups consume only in the lowest tier, but they can't the regulator can't isolate price changes to the lowest tier because all household groups pay this tier, since they pay a weighted average of the blocks of consumption in which they consume. So this is the only lever regulators have to try and distribute costs across households. And then I'll conduct an input-output analysis of the economy, which is essentially a representation from national accounts that has the production and consumption relationships between inputs and outputs, so that if one assumes that costs are passed through in proportion to which inputs are used in the production of goods and services, then I can estimate from a household budget what the price increase would be to a household based on a weighted average of the price increases of the different components of their consumption bundle. But the regulator has no ability to control how those costs are distributed. So with those levers, like I said, I impute a certain social welfare objective to their decision making, and I evaluate two different objectives. One is to maximize efficiency, which is essentially to maximize total consumption, and the other is to maximize equity, which is to minimize the welfare losses to the lowest income groups and to minimize the inequality in the distribution of income for people below a poverty threshold. But regulators set prices on the basis of constraints, the main constraint being that they have to recover costs and that they also have to balance supply and demand. And so this is what leads to outages. Households then respond to the price changes, and I use a fairly standard utility function called a constant elasticity of substitution function that essentially allows me to model households' trade-offs between different price increases between electricity and other goods. And I model other goods as a composite, stylized, single good that represents all other expenditure. And so based on the elasticity to price increases, households choose how much of each that they want to consume. But because of chronic scarcity, they may not actually receive the entire extent of their consumption, the desired consumption, and so they end up with an actual demand, and they have a net welfare change as a result of that consumption in response to a price change. That's okay, for some reason. That's funny.
I just plug it into the wall here.
Right back here. David, right here. Thanks. Right. Right. So the welfare changes that households face from a net change in prices, regulators can then take into account in their decision making so that they develop an optimal price trajectory in response to a supply cost increase. So let me just show you how I represent welfare before I show you some results. I use a fairly standard representation in welfare economics of what is the monetary equivalent of a change in utility that results from a set of price changes. So if households consume a certain amount of other goods and electricity based on their budget to maximize utility, if they face a price increase, in this case electricity prices increase to a greater extent, they face a reduced utility, and moreover if they have supply interruptions their utility reduces even more. And then I calculate in money terms what households would accept to experience this utility change but at the original baseline price levels, so as to provide a way to determine the welfare loss with respect to a baseline. And by converting this utility change to money metrics, I'm able to compare the welfare losses across different households. So the first important finding, which is new in the Indian context, is as follows. If the regulator were to apply a cost increase and direct that cost increase solely to residential prices, then you would have budget impacts indicated by the blue bar. Alternatively, if the regulator applied that cost increase exclusively to industrial price changes, you would have the budget impacts indicated by the red bar. And the most important finding here is that aside from the highest income group, all other income groups prefer to face a cost increase through industrial price increases as opposed to residential price increases. And that's a new finding. And this immediately echoes the tension that regulators face to keep industrial prices low in face of political pressures, but in order to protect consumers, they would want to actually increase industrial prices. And this has a bearing on the results thereafter. So let me describe the results. I show here the average residential prices for all the income groups and the welfare loss as a percentage of income based on the welfare calculation I described. So in the base case, meeting India's pledge in Cancun only from supply side changes would actually be efficient to increase all rates proportionately to all household groups, which means that there would be adverse impacts on low income households on the order of 6% of their budget. Now this is important because like I said, the carbon intensity target was almost an afterthought on the part of Indian government, and under certain scenarios where energy intensity of the economy increases and India were to actually commit to honoring that pledge, there would be adverse consequences to households of honoring that pledge. Now if they were to adopt the other social welfare objective of equity and shield low income households from income shocks, they would have to lower residential prices and increase industrial rates for the reason I just mentioned, as well as increase other residential rates by probably politically infeasible levels. And that is unlikely to be the case, leading to welfare losses of 12 to 15% of the household budget. So in other words, this reinforces that it is very likely that there would be those adverse distributional effects from simply following the Cancun pledge. However, an interesting finding that I thought was new is that if the industrial elasticity were low, that means if industrials migrated away from the grid to a lesser extent in response to a price change, regulators could rely on revenues from industry to a much greater extent, allowing them the flexibility to keep residential prices low and yet have a net increase in efficiency. So in the case where you have low industrial migration, it is both equitable as well as efficient to price electricity in a way that increases industrial rates and keeps residential rates low. So some of the findings to summarize, first of all, is what I said about the adverse distributional impacts. The second is that regulators have leverage to distribute costs across household groups, but it depends upon other policies towards industrial customers. So this means it's hard to specify what the distributional impacts of a mitigation policy would be in the absence of considering existing policies in the economy. Now what I haven't discussed in my thesis, what's extraneous issues, is that the reason why industries migrate away from the grid has to do with a lot of institutional failures in the electricity system and in governance. And so it is in fact these governance failures that is limiting the flexibility of regulators to distribute mitigation costs across households. And notice also that in the case where elasticity were low and if it were both equitable and efficient to keep residential prices low and industrial prices high, given the political pressures to keep industrial rates low, regulators may not actually do that. So that in some sense is an example of the misallocation of costs I was referring to earlier on, that when the government could be faulted with. And the last finding is that the rural poor are actually no worse off with mitigation than without. That is, households that are experiencing outages of 8 to 10 hours, with mitigation, the contraction in demand is sufficient to obviate the need for load interruptions to the same extent. And so the welfare gain from getting electricity offsets, or more than offsets, the welfare loss from higher energy prices. And this doesn't even account for some of the deeper impacts of facing supply interruptions, such as my children don't study at night because they don't have light, or my livelihood is impacted. This is a very minimal view of supply interruption costs. So the main message here is that aside from the fact that the Cancun pledge has certain distributional impacts, what I've captured here is the influence of institutional conditions on the ability of regulators to distribute costs for mitigation. I want to briefly describe the last study, which is a study of kerosene subsidies. The situation with kerosene subsidies in India is that it is used widely, of course, as a backup fuel for cooking and for lighting homes, but it is known to be plagued with inefficiencies. In fact, organized crime controls most of the supply chain, and about 40 to 50% of kerosene subsidies are diverted to other sectors. So the current policy scenario environment is that governments want to phase out subsidies, and their justification for doing so is fairly weak on the grounds that they would not have any distributional impacts. And so I question that assumption in my analysis, because what about the other 50% of supply, and to what extent does that get distributed to households? And I wanted to analyze that. So I formally undertook analysis of how effective kerosene subsidies are as instruments of income redistribution in India. And my approach was to calculate certain metrics, that is materiality, the incidence of the subsidy on households, progressivity, do poor households gain more than rich households, and efficacy, what's the total value of the subsidy that actually reaches households and serves its intended purpose. And my key finding is that kerosene benefits are restricted mainly to urban areas where households don't have good access to affordable alternatives, LPG or wood. But for the most part in rural areas, they don't have significant benefits. So it makes sense to restrict subsidies to urban areas. But what is also interesting in my analysis is what are the causes of failure of the remaining part of the subsidy. And I distinguish between implementation and design failures. So I calculated that only 26% of the subsidy value actually reaches households. But let's understand why that is the case. The green line indicates the quotas for households that they are entitled to based on their cooking needs, which is how the government decides what kerosene allocations households should have. But the bar graph shows the actual demand of kerosene. And clearly there's a huge gap, because in rural areas, people use kerosene only for lighting, but the allocation is on the basis of cooking needs. So this is clearly a design failure. On the other hand, the mustard, bar versus component versus the red component, the mustard component indicates the actual subsidy they get, and the red component indicates what they actually forced to buy in the open market, which is to say that even the kerosene they're entitled to, they don't get because of rent seeking and other forms of failures in the system. And that is sort of an implementation failure, because it's a problem with the institutions that actually deliver the subsidies. And if one compares this to the urban areas, one finds that there is in fact a much closer match between the household's allocation and the kerosene demand. And so this is one of the reasons why it makes much more sense to direct kerosene subsidies to households in urban areas alone. But there is a lot more of their kerosene demand that they have to meet in the black market. In any case, this points to another thought that I expressed in the first part of the study, which is that perhaps this design failure is an avoidable failure because it can be redressed through a simple policy change in how you design the subsidy, whereas the implementation failure may involve much more difficult choices of removing entrenched interest in the economy, which would be difficult to do. So I feel like I've covered half my dissertation, but I'm here at mostly the end of what I did. And what I've tried to do is to quantify the distributional impacts of energy institutions in India. That is, to what extent do institutions influence the distributional impacts of energy policies. And in the global justice regime, I've tried to identify the role of national policies and institutions in the terms and outcomes of climate agreements that are designed to exempt the poor. In the future, what I'd like to do is replicate this analysis in other countries. The methodology that I've developed is actually applicable in most developing country contexts, and I could literally swap out data and perform the same analysis in other countries. And also to look forward into evaluating what the distributional impacts would be of different growth policies. And in the global justice and international climate policy domain, there are a lot of issues. One of them is, what is the commensurability of thresholds across developing countries? Do we have the right kinds of metrics to draw conclusions about what are comparable burdens that people are bearing in different countries? And with that, I thank you for your patience, attention, and tolerance for trauma. And we'll be happy to field questions. Marilyn? Oh, Nina?
So I just noticed in your urban areas, your poorest categories don't use much kerosene.
Right.
What do they use?
That's because there are some urban users who still access wood. And so essentially it's an economic decision as to what household fuel they use. So the lowest income groups in urban areas, it's not a lot of people, but there are about 18 to 20% of urban households who still rely on wood. But those who have no access to wood physically, they can't afford LPG, so the kerosene is their primary cooking fuel. And so they're the ones who benefit most from the kerosene subsidy.
Yeah, so very good presentation, lots of different fields covered. I had a couple just sort of small factual questions I was going to ask you about. The first was, you talk about kind of distributional aspects for electricity and spend a lot of time talking about that. And you may have covered this a little bit, but obviously the lowest income quartile, et cetera, they're not even on the grid at the most part. And so sort of how does that maybe affect, or if you could go into that maybe a little bit more, the distributional analysis. And the second point was about reasons for industrial customers migrating that might affect your analysis, because my impression has been, in talking to Indian corporates, that that's less been a price-based decision, although obviously the price regime is inverted from what's typical, and more of a security of supply decision, and that perhaps maybe they'd even find it preferable if their supply would be better, just as you mentioned, the rural poor getting utility boost from seeing more secure supply.
Yeah, so on the first question, like I pointed out, that's not something I actually cover. So there is a large section of the Indian population that does not have access, and most of the studies today actually focus on that population, as in what would be the cost to try and provide low carbon access to those households. And so I just don't consider those. I'm thinking about households that do have access, which constitutes a significant amount of the poor as well.
So it's a distributional thing for the lower middle class, or the kind of upper lower class, or however you want to call it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there's a strict segmentation along income lines between those who don't have access and have access. You would find them to be actually parallel groups to some extent. Like I said, 60% of households are earning less than $2 a day. So I just don't address the question that you asked, the first question. The second question, it's absolutely true. And I think, first of all, in the case of Maharashtra, it just empirically is not the case anymore, because what utilities have been doing to woo customers back is to provide them with dedicated lines and interruptions only once a day on Saturdays, and they have 24/7 reliable supply other than that. So their decisions are driven more by cost. But broadly speaking, it's absolutely correct that the historical motivation for industrial migration is security of supply. But it's a combination of security of supply and prices that makes their decision to use backup generation. And this actually points to the need for a broader look at energy policies, because it is the price of diesel that actually influences the incentive to get off the grid in the first place, even though from a broad efficiency perspective it may not be the best strategy for the economy because of diseconomies of scale and the capital costs of diesel generators.
We have a question back there.
I don't think.
I'm sure you've thought about it, but I didn't see, or at least I didn't catch it in the presentation. Have you thought about combinations of mitigation policies and how they interact? For example, in the case of the rural poor, is there, for instance, a firewood issue there, and how those impacts may also have not only redistributional secondary effects, as it were, but also perhaps environmental effects?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. There are. There's a lot of studies on trying to examine the co-benefits between different parts of policies, including between mitigation policies and between mitigation policies and other policies. And in my case, I am isolating specific mitigation policies, basically energy price increases. And the only interactions that I'm looking at are with other policies in the electricity sector, such as supply interruptions. And I don't combine those sorts of policies explicitly in the study. But I think there would be synergies between looking at liquid petroleum gas policies and kerosene policies, for example, as an extension to this work, because the use of kerosene is driven by essentially poor reliability in LPG supply. And that has implications for emissions as well. So an integrated view of both those policies would certainly be, a next step to go to.
One more back here.
Yeah, so I know in the international negotiations, the question of national sovereignty is one of the most touchiest subjects, and we've seen that play out in the monitoring, reporting, and verification debate. Do you have any sense, like roughly, is this a deal like India would be open to, exemptions for forests in return for some restrictions at the international level in terms of how mitigation could be implemented in the country?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the answer is, they would not be interested in this at all. If I submitted my paper to a government official and asked them for an appointment, they'd probably refuse me one. But what's that? I mean, so the policy environment in India, as in any other country, is complex and consists of many different voices. And the sort of mainstream view is to try and separate out as much as possible intranational equity issues from international issues. And the argument given is that these are separable because it's a second order effect for the equity issues within a country. And my perspective is fine, that'll play out in the kind of exemption that I'm defining, because if indeed the differences in income distribution between India and the US mask those of between people within India, then the exemption burden that India actually bears on the basis of this may be very small in any case, once one takes away an exemption for the poor. So I guess what I should clarify is that my analysis is strictly looking at the implications of defining this exemption without prejudice to how what burden sharing rules are defined for those who are non-poor. So it could be that one applies, for example, a non-linear sliding scale for the contribution of those who are above a certain income level. And so if you're paying a proportion to the square of your income, then the contribution of the US would absolutely dwarf anything in India. And but in any case, the point is there's no good moral justification for separating out these two. To me, it's more of a political issue. But to the extent that there is a moral justification for separating out the relative income distribution, that would play out in this kind of analysis.
I think that's probably enough great questions, and I'm also afraid that the audience questions will get definitely will. So thank you very much. You can stay in there. We can stay in here.
Oh, really? Yeah. I'd like to take a minute, actually, if I may.
You can have two.
Okay. I wanted to thank some people. And most of all, I wanted to thank my committee for all of their support. I think I chose my committee really well. And I just wanted to share that, especially Debra and Josh, thank you for indulging my interest in philosophy. It really was mind expanding. And David, thank you for continuing to support me even after moving to San Diego. And holding my feet to the ground and thinking about policy. And most of all, Larry, for your patience and guidance. It was very valuable to me, especially after Steve's passing. And of course, I have a lot of people I'd like to thank that I'm not going to name, except Paul Baer deserves special mention because his ideas influenced my thinking a fair amount. And most importantly, I wanted to thank Steve. I'm indebted to him. I wouldn't have had the courage to do this thesis were it not for his encouragement. Thank you.